Everyone, thank you for being here. Welcome to another segment of How to Be a DM. I have a wonderful guest today, kind of a jack of all trades, everything from biology professor to an expert dungeon master. You may know him as co-host of the Edition Wars podcast and also dungeon master for DnDeBrief. Very, very clever name there, which I love. A live stream D&D game that features post-game commentary and analysis, which I think may also be a great way for DMs to glean some new tips as well. Everybody, please welcome Samuel Dillon. Yay!
Hello.
My goodness, you really do have quite the background.
I've been playing for a really long time, and I'm one of those people who I feel like I'm always learning. So it never gets stale, right? It's always got to learn.
Judging from the amount of books behind you right now, that seems apropos.
Yes.
When did you start playing D&D?
1982.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
early adapter.
My brother, he's 3 years older than me, and he got one of the basic boxes for Christmas one year, and quickly handed that off to me as he got the big AD&D first edition books and said, "Here, you can have the basic." And the first D&D product I think I ever bought with my own money was Frank Mincer's Redbox D&D. So
nice.
Yeah.
That must have been a big moment for you.
Oh, I'm telling you, like just so many memories and yeah, just, I mean, a lifetime of fun, right?
Oh,
I mean,
that's
just
great.
Amazing. Yeah.
So did you and your brother play together, or was your brother like off doing advanced things and you were?
Yeah, no. We played together. We had a big map of the world of Greyhawk on our wall in the room.
Nice.
And we used to play all the time. It was great. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So I have family memories, and then I have friend memories, and then, it's just, it's the thing. It's one of the glues of my life, so to speak.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It is definitely good for that, for the memories and forming those bonds, and that's really cool. That's cool. Yeah. So your name came to me as someone who has a lot of experience in how to weave character backstories into adventures.
Yes.
So the first time I played D&D, I had a dungeon master that didn't even ask about our backstories. Okay. I, of course, came up with one because that was my favorite part of creating a character. I just was like, I'm offering this up, and I'm just going to be throwing it into the game whenever. But then the second time I played, the dungeon master did ask for backstories, as well as a connection, like how we had to choose one other player and write a little bit about how we knew that player. Okay, well, that's really interesting. But I immediately became immersed in this campaign because I had connections to, people were writing stories about how they knew my character, and I thought it was wow, what a cool way to bring us all together in this. So no doubt backstories I think are important to a game.
Absolutely.
Right?
Sure. Yeah.
But as a dungeon master, I feel like you have so many other things you have to keep track of, and now you want me to weave these into the story that I'm telling? I wouldn't even know where to begin. I will leave it to you.
Okay, well, luckily for you, I have a page of notes here.
Yay!
that I wrote down.
All right.
It's really funny you say that, because I have sort of a kind of things that you can do to make this work, and then I have sort of 3 things to watch out for.
Okay.
That could make it not work. The first thing is it's sort of I lettered things A, B, C, D, and then I thought of one and I put an A number 1.
I like it. Okay.
And I think A number 1 is, from the DM perspective, donate time to work in the backstories thoughtfully, right? Don't pretend you're going to do it. Don't ask for backstories from your players and then really not do anything with them.
Yes.
If you're going to do that, then that's fair. I know people, lives are busy, and sometimes, it's so much just to read the adventure or to make an adventure that it's hard to work that in. And if you can't do that, that's fine. There's no sort of bad, wrong fun about this, right? It's more about, if you want to do this, you need to be doing it thoughtfully. And the very first thing, then having said that, the very first thing you should do is Use the things that are already available to you. So talk to your players, get a backstory from your players, but don't just say, hey, players, send me a backstory, right? Send me a background, send me a backstory, tell me about your character. Give them parameters. If you want 2 paragraphs, tell them 2 paragraphs and not 3-page long paragraphs, right? 2 paragraphs on 1 page. And I want to know your parents' names and the rival from the town that you grew up in. Or I want to know why you're in the current town. Or I want to know what your main motivation is. Or all 3 of those, right? And that's the sort of first step, is make sure you're going to do it thoughtfully. And then that means you need the input from the players, because it's their character and they're going to be the one playing it in the campaign, regardless of what the entire plot of your whole story is and what you've decided, or what adventure book you picked up and whoever wrote that. The players are really the story, right? The players are the story. So they need to feel like their backstory fits in there somewhere. Otherwise, why would they be in this story? Mm-hmm. So when you ask them as a DM for their story, give them some parameters. Make it short, 2 or 3 sentences, 2 or 3 paragraphs, and ask them for some specifics. Where are they from? What was their childhood like? But just in a very generic term, happy, sad, lonely, exciting, right? Did they know their parents? I know there's this lone wolf, there's the lone wolf trope. Everybody wants to be, I can't have anybody that I care about because then the DM will use it against me. That's not the way to go necessarily. Although if that's your character concept, that's your character concept. But you have to give something for the DM to be able to work with. And so to grease those wheels, so to speak, when the DM does that, when the DM asks for the backstory, give some parameters. Tell them what you want. And then talk to them about it, right? Don't just say, okay, that's it. Okay, that's fine. Actually look at their backstory. Okay, so that's the sort of first thing. Be intentional about it, right. Be thoughtful about it, and then ask the players for something. And do that. So, there's a session 0 kind of concept out there where you meet with your players before the first actual session of the game. And either everybody talks about their characters or they make their characters right there, or you talk about the themes of the game, you talk about the main storylines that are going to be a part of the game. I'm running Rime of the Frost Maiden, so I met with my group a couple weeks ago and I told them the basic themes of the story without giving away any major spoilers. And I said, so when you create your character, you need to be doing 2 things. Number 1, figuring out making sure that your character is built to be able to withstand the types of challenges that I'm talking about and the sort of horror aspects of it. But also, why is your character even there? Why is your character in that region? It doesn't necessarily have to be up to the DM to make that happen. It can be up to the players, or it can be a conversation amongst everyone about how all of those things came together. And if you have a session 0 and you have that type of interaction between the players and between the DM and the players, then those things sometimes, not always, those things sometimes sort of organically grow out. Ooh, my character can know your character because maybe we're from the same town and we're traveling on the same ship up to the northern reaches or whatever. Or maybe they just completely come to the session and they've already made their characters and they already think they know what they want to do, but still having that session 0 gives them the opportunity to introduce their backstory to the DM and also to the other players. And then maybe you can kind of massage that and work through it and try to get them connected in a way. Because as you mentioned earlier, that game that you had where your backstory was kind of intertwined with another one, you were already invested in that before the game even really started. And that's kind of what we want, right? That's the whole reason for making the backstory something that's important. And so there's that. But, there's a lot of preferences here, right? There's a lot of, well, I don't DM that way, or I DM this way over here, or, well, my players don't like having a session 0, or they do this, or they, and so you kind of have to navigate those waters in a way that makes sense for your table. And when you do that, though, there's still, no matter what, needs to be conversation between the DM and the players. And when the DM is having conversation with the player, it's okay to give them parameters and to say, here's what I need from you. And it can be very vague or it can be very detailed, but it needs to be this much information and it needs to have these specific things. And as long as the DM is really going to take some of that and use it, then it'll work out. It'll work out. Even if it's all new to some players or they're not used to doing it that way or you've never done it that way before, it will work out because they'll start to see how you've sprinkled in parts of their background into the game, regardless of whether you're playing a homebrew or a pre-written adventure. So that's one thing. So, I mean, there are lots of elements to this. And so I kind of have my top three that I ask for. I ask for the player's motivation, or the PC's motivation. The player's motivation is to have fun, right?
Right.
I ask for the PC's motivation. I ask for their rivals and allies, at least one of each. And I ask for either something about their family or something about the location they're from, depending on the campaign. And usually if you give them that prompt of like 3 things that you want to know, they'll write a little bit more than that, and they'll get enough juice in there that you can make it so that it works with the game. And so it's really important to talk to your players. It's really that's probably should be my number one. Talk to your players. That's the main thing. Then when I have my session 0, I trick my players, because the other thing I do is, as they're talking about their characters and they're creating their characters, and we've talked about themes, and we've talked about everything, I then give them a couple of difficult questions. I'll pick a player and I'll say, Jonas, what is your character's biggest fear? And I'll give them time to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
That's putting people on the spot. And then I move on and I'll say, Sarah, who does your character, out of these 5 people that are sitting here at the table, who does your character trust the most, and why?
Interesting.
Right?
You ask them that like in front of the other players?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And depending on the team, depending on the group, some of them will pipe in and say, ooh, well, what if you trust me because I did this for you? Or maybe I've known you all my life. Maybe I'll change my backstory a little bit and we'll say we've known each other. We're from the same town, or, oh, we went to the same temple, or, something like that. And those types of questions that are a little bit surprised. See, if you tell them beforehand, they're just going to come up with the answers as part of their backstory.
Yeah.
And then they're going to show up and they're going to have it all solid in their mind, and it's going to be less flexible in terms of how things work at the table during a session 0. And so ask questions about fear, about trust, about motivations, about who they know, about why they're in a location. Any or all of those will get people starting to talk to each other about it. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth, right? If the players aren't used to it, if the DM is trying to do this for the first time and the players aren't into it, prompt them. Say, well, I noticed in your backstory, you said this thing over here. You said that you're not close to your father. He used to go off on business trips because he was a merchant and he used to go with the caravan. And so you didn't know him very well. How did that affect your mother and your brother? Right? Are you protective of your family because of that? Are you resentful of your father because of that? Like, start talking about those relationships, and they'll start thinking about, okay, well, if this was a real person, they might have thought this, or maybe they didn't care. Maybe it made them resentful and they didn't care, and that's why they're out adventuring. And that's a good piece of information to know, especially because then they might push back on that. Oh, well, my father wasn't a caravan person, caravaneer. He wasn't a merchant, or maybe he was just a guard. So he wasn't some, high up person who had a lot of money. Maybe he was just some lowly guard. Oh, so then you mean you think that his job wasn't worthy of him being gone so much? So that's what you resent? It's that sort of thing where there's a kind of a thin line, right? There's a fine line, because you don't want to be offensive to somebody, right? And you also don't want to get too close to something that might be in their real life, right?
Right, yes.
Right, it sounds weird, but we're supposed to be having fun. So you don't want to get too heavy on the psychological components here, but it kind of depends on the story. As I mentioned, Rhyme and the Frost Maiden earlier, it's a horror story.
Yeah.
It really is about a horrific environment and some horrific things that some people are being forced to do because of the environmental disaster that's happening to them and around them. And so that's going to have horror elements. So maybe I should retract this and go back to the beginning and say, make sure that the players that you're dealing with are going to be into this as well. That they, that's the first question in session 0 is, are you ready for this theme? And is that okay with you? And if it's not, then that becomes a whole different conversation. But let's assume they are. There's horror elements, and you need to make sure that you can pick up those horror elements. Or maybe it's a fantastical adventure. Maybe it's a town adventure like, Dragon Heist, Waterdeep Dragon Heist. Well, now it's going to make a difference if the character has a backstory where they're not from Waterdeep at all. When they get there, they're not going to know anybody, right? Or maybe they're a noble in Waterdeep. They're from a noble family. Well, that's a completely different, 100% separate situation. How do you get those people together? And the answer is you have to talk to both people and ask them how they know each other. Ask them, how does your character know this other person? Why is your character's not from Waterdeep? They're showing up in Waterdeep. How are they going to know this noble person? We got to figure that out. And the DM can help figure that out, and the players can help figure that out. And then once you know that, then you can work both of their stories into the actual game. Okay, so I'm sort of, my next tip is sort of a little bit related to that.
Okay.
Because I mentioned nobles. And the thing is that the game already comes with tools for the DM to use built in, right? The game comes with a setup where, as part of character creation, players choose a background, technically the background in the player's handbook for their character, or, an extra one based on whatever adventure they're playing. And those backgrounds come with a feature, right? It's not just the mechanical, oh, well, because of this background, you know how to use thieves' tools. It's also, here's a feature. You have a criminal contact, or you have the ability to go to a temple that is the deity that you were an acolyte for, and you will always be given healing from that temple because of your acolyte background. Or you're a hermit, and your hermit background, you experienced something while you were a hermit, and the feature says that now you're looking for the reason for whatever that experience was. And so when you're talking to your players, figure out what their background is and why did they choose that background, right? And that background also comes with ideals, bonds, and flaws, and a little, a rolly table for personality. And all of that is already built into the game. And I know that some people use it to a greater extent than others. And that's okay. But if it's part of the character creation process and the character, the player is choosing a background for their character, the DM should be paying attention to that. So when the person says, oh, I'm the charlatan background, or I'm a criminal background, or I'm a noble background. Well, okay, you're a noble background. What does that mean for the campaign? Right? Because it depends on where your campaign is, what that means. If you're in a homebrew world and it's really heavily based on kingdoms and baronies and duchies, and there's really distinct political borders, and there's a lot of machinations that are happening regarding the royal families and their quest for power and more land, it's going to make a difference if your character has a noble background. Right? Is their family very active, or are they running away from their family because they found out their family is corrupt? Or are they being hidden because they are the true heir and, the family doesn't want them to be known about because then they might be, a target of assassination attempts or something, right? There's a lot of different things in there to play with, all because the player chose the noble background for their character. And so all of those true, I call them mechanical bits, right? Because they're actually in the player's handbook and there's something that is part of character creation. Those mechanical bits lead to story. And so there's a mindset there that has to be in play, where the DM needs to be thinking about, okay, these are mechanical bits. Okay, this is a fighter, this is a warlock, this is whatever class and race combination. And then also there's this background. Okay, well, this background, the player usually chooses it to fit within their 2-paragraph backstory, right? But now let's make all of that work within the confines of the actual campaign we're playing. And for that, that's where the DM's work comes in, right? Mm-hmm. Where you need to know the basic plot line of your story. Even if you're a very heavy improvisational DM and you have kind of an outline and then you let the players drive the story, or if you're running a published book where there are specific NPCs, there are specific events that have to occur, there are things for the players to react to, either one of those, you still need to have an idea of how you can fit the players in there, their PCs in there, right? So once again, I step back to session 0. If you're running a seafaring campaign, if you're running Saltmarsh, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and you know that your players are going to find a boat and they're going to be out on the sea, or if they're going to start on the sea coming into dock at Saltmarsh, then when you ask them for their background, you ask them, well, how do you know anything about boats? What is your boating background that puts your PC on that ship? And that becomes part of their background, whether they had originally written it in there or not. And so for Rime of the Frost Maiden, it's, why are you going up to the frozen north? There has to be some reason. You're either from there or you're going there. And it's a devastated area. So there has to be a reason for you to be going there. And if you don't know as a player, that's when the DM player conversation has to occur. And that's going to let the DM add that in. And it's okay to give that constraint when you request the background. Okay, I want two paragraphs of background, and in the background, you have to tell me why you're going or why you're in Icewind Dale. And then if the player doesn't know, they can ask.
Yeah. Okay. But so then you get a lot of information from player.
Well,
I mean, you're getting like a page of information basically from each player.
Sort of, right? So I know it sounds like I'm asking for a lot, but
no, I think that's a totally fair amount.
If I've got 5 players and they each have like 2 paragraphs of backstory, and then I have a list of, 2 rivals and 2 allies for each of them and location and all that, it ends up being more like a bulleted list.
Yeah.
That I can circle things and make a chart. This one's connected to this one, this person. Another good one is organizations. If they're related to an organization that exists in the setting or in the adventure, now you can, if you don't know how to connect some PCs, you can maybe make their backstory have some organizations in them, some factions, and then you can connect that. And so that's why you need that information. So it's a lot of information. Yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is a lot of information.
So is this like, you run your own, like, do you do homebrew campaigns or? You said both. You're actually running a published one now. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I'm running published one now, but my DnDeBrief is completely homebrew, my own setting. So
does their backgrounds, does it ever inform the story that you are about to tell? Or is
Absolutely.
it like, okay, so things can change from your perspective too, based on
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And, and actually that's funny that you asked that, because that's true of my homebrew setting. But also it's true of my Rime of the Frost Maiden game, because when I did my session 0 for Rime of the Frost Maiden, one of the things that Wizards of the Coast did the past couple of adventures is they put secrets into the adventure that players can draw, or that you can, as the DM, you can hand them out or whatnot. And what I did was I went through and I looked at the players had told me, I'm going to play this type of character, and I think my background is going to be this. And I said, okay, so I went through the secrets and I picked 2 for each person. And I fiddled with them. Now, I didn't just give them the secret as raw material here. I actually decided to change them a little bit and say, well, for this player, this secret would have this kind of impact. And I changed the way I worded it. I didn't just hand it out as written in the book. And so then I let them pick which one they wanted out of the 2 or 3. And because I changed it, I made sure that whatever I changed, I could actually connect that to different pieces of the adventure later on. So, for example, I did not offer anyone the Drizzt Do'Urden fan background.
Oh.
Because that's, I know, unfortunately, but that's not part of my campaign, right? Yeah. So to offer that to someone doesn't really have a lot of gravitas in the game, because it's not really going to have any effect. But I want their secret to have gravitas. And so I had to change them to fit the character, and then that also makes the character care more about what's happening in the area, because they have a secret about their life that has either pushed them to that area or that is related to that area. So my advice there is, if you're a DM and you have this whole plot laid out for your homebrew world, or you have an adventure that you're reading and you're gonna make this adventure, read ahead a little bit, right? Or plan ahead a little bit and know who your NPCs are, and feel free to absolutely change one of those NPCs so that they have something to do. Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 NPCs in Rime of the Frost Maiden, which are they have a direct relation to the backstory to 2 of my PCs right now.
You have done that.
I just did. I mean, it's not even in the book, but because I fiddled with the backstories, with the secrets, and I could make that appealing to the player the way that I changed them. Right. So the job isn't to screw the players, right? The job isn't to, I'm going to do something that's really going to make it hard for them, or to, but the job is to make it interesting and to make them care about the game and their character. And so if I can do that with a secret that I've changed, or with an NPC that they meet, right? Or, I mentioned a caravan thing. I once ran a campaign where that actually happened, where the player said, well, my father was a merchant and he used to go with the caravan, so he would be gone for months at a time. And, but it came out in the game that they had a family crest because they were a merchant family. And so later on, much later on in the campaign, when he had already left his hometown, they find some crates with his family crest, his merchant family crest on it. That wasn't written in the adventure, but what was written was there were some crates there with some materials in this cultist hideout. Well, hey, look, you recognize this crest, and I can say to that player in private, you recognize this crest as your family merchant crest. Or at least the one that you recognize. Maybe it was an early iteration of it and they don't use that one anymore, or whatever,
really
right?
Cool.
Yeah, and then I can let that player decide whether they tell the other PCs, or whether there's a connection there or not. And if the player really digs it, I'll lean hard into it. If the player's like, it's not really, I'm more focused on this part, well, that's okay too, right? So it was a little nugget of information. It may be of interest and maybe not, but we can move on from there without disrupting the character's idea of their own, or the player's idea of their own character, right?
Yeah.
But yes, absolutely, I change NPCs, and yes, absolutely.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned asking them who their rivals were or who their allies were, I thought, well, you could potentially make one of them an NPC, just sub them out of
absolutely.
Interesting. So what I like about, well, I guess, okay, one last question.
Sure.
But how do you distribute this information throughout the campaign? Is it just when it feels natural to drop some of these nuggets, or do you actually plot them out?
So it depends, which I know is a very unsatisfying answer.
No, it's okay.
But so one of my caveats, my things to watch out for, is don't accidentally make it so that the whole campaign hangs on one character.
Oh yeah, right? We have to do your list of watch-outs.
Yeah. So unfortunately, because some players will really grab onto this sort of thing and they'll really love it, and some will be kind of midline, okay, it's interesting, but I really want to play this character and see how they play out versus worrying about my backstory kind of thing. So it kind of depends. And the idea is, the way that I look at it is, if I split my campaign into kind of 3 basic arcs, okay, no matter what it is, whether I'm doing a published campaign or whether I'm doing something I homebrew, I try to envision it as 3 kind of arcs. And there needs to be a player backstory that is brought up and resolved in each of those arcs. And so, or at least resolved to a satisfactory amount within the story. So, for example, one of my players right now is playing an enlightened familiar, and so they were uplifted, right? And so their former life was as a familiar, and they are now sort of this PC level kind of character.
I didn't even know that was possible, and I love it.
It's really awesome. My players are great. And so the thing is that this individual is a tabaxi because they used to be a cat.
That's so good.
And so when they were a cat, they lived in a wizard's library, right? It's in a wizard's tower with a library and with, all this arcane magic going around. And so there are some NPCs in Rime of the Frost Maiden where it makes a lot of sense if that cat, when it was still in its kitten form, was around when a couple of these NPCs from the Arcane Brotherhood were looking for information and went to that library or to that wizard's tower. So right there, I have made a connection between that character's sort of odd, weird backstory and the NPCs that these people are going to meet. And that's not something where the cat will see, the Tabaxi, now it's Tabaxi, will see that Arcane Brotherhood, wizard and say, oh, I know you. But it is something where I could say, this person looks really familiar to you and you're not sure where you know them. And that's great in a story like Rime of the Frost Maiden because it's about paranoia
right.
and fear and loneliness and wow, this thing is happening and I don't know if this person is after me or if I recognize them or if I really do even recognize them and so you can see these little things, right? And that player, I hope they're not listening to this, but
yeah, we're gonna have to tell them to tune out around minute 28.
Yeah. But so that's like one example where I can put something from that person's backstory. That player created that backstory, and we did that in collaboration. I approved that because it's kind of a funky, backstory thing happening. But I approved that, and immediately when I did that, I had it as a thought to, okay, well, how could this be related to what's happening in the actual campaign? And so knowing a little more of the story than the first chapter, for example, allows me to think about, okay, well, this NPC is going to show up. Maybe I'll make this NPC be related to this person's background. And maybe I'll make this company over here that has a tavern in, one of the 10 towns, I'll make that be related to this person's backstory. And something as small as that, changing that into, oh, well, that's a person who was from a rival tribe. I have a Reged tribesman in my party. And so maybe there was a rival tribe and that person also went civilized and now owns a tavern in one of the 10 towns. And so rather than use one of the tavern owners in the book, I'll use that person because that's what my player said. They had a rival who left the tribe and went civilized. So, you know what I mean? So it's that sort of thing. So do I plan it? Yes. Is it sometimes not planned? Absolutely. It's just, but I try to split things into 3 pieces and say, okay, in this first arc, I want at least one of the backstory items to be related, right? And because I keep going back to this because it's the game I'm currently running, but because in Rime of the Frost Maiden, there are these secrets, the players know their own secret, but they don't necessarily know all the other players' secrets.
Okay.
And I gave them that choice. I said during the session 0, I had given them all secrets already. And I said to them, you can feel free to tell everyone else your secrets, or you can keep that close to the vest. It's completely up to you. I won't spill the beans. It's however you want to do it, because I know that this particular group, they will be honest and do it how they want. And when it's time for that secret to come out, they'll tell everyone and make it a really dramatic moment because that's the type of players they are.
Nice.
So I know that when I start pulling on those threads of the backstories and I start mentioning things to them, they're going to know that their secret is getting closer to being outed. Oh. And so it gets really fun. Yeah.
Do you have other watch outs on your list?
Yeah. So the first one, that was the first one. It's probably the most important. Watch out for having one that is so great that it makes that PC the focus of the entire campaign.
Yes.
That's not fair to everyone else.
No.
And it's not fair also to that player.
Yeah.
Because even though it might seem fun at first and wow, this DM really enjoyed my backstory and I'm really interested in this, but is it a lot of pressure?
Yes.
Is it is it hard to not know what's going on? Sometimes as DMs, we forget we already have everything in our head maybe, and the players don't know what's happening really. Yeah. So there's that. The second one is don't make too much work for yourself. Like when you mentioned, you get a lot of information, right? So the thing is that the reason I keep mentioning and going back to a session 0, or it doesn't even really have to be a full session. It could be a Discord conversation or an email conversation or or a phone conversation with one of your players, where you actually say to them, okay, let's take 10 minutes and talk about your backstory and just get an idea of how that works. And in that case, you just let the player tell you what they really want their character to be, or how they envision it, at least at first, and let them do the work. And if they give you enough information, and you know enough about kind of the plot line and the story as is, you can then use that information to figure out how to attach them to the backstory. It's a skill, though, and DMing is more an art than a science. So, it depends on how well you do that, but try not to give yourself too much work, because it's really easy to fall into that boat and try to make the whole campaign only about their backstories. And that's also not okay, right? You need to also have a story that isn't just related to their backstories, right?
Yes.
And then my last one is, don't destroy player agency. So if the player said in their backstory, both of my parents were killed in an orc raid on my village, and it decimated almost all the village, and only me and 2 other families got out. Don't have your character's long lost brother and mom show up later on. Right?
Right.
Like, that is not respectful of the backstory that person had. And so that wouldn't work. Or if they said, my parents are farmers, don't destroy that town that their parents are farmers in, right? Just to destroy it, just to bring, like, if that's the only way you can think to bring that character into the story, do something else. Try to think of something else, because you don't always want to be, leaning on tragedies to give the PCs a motivation. So rather than do something like that, or try to come up with something like that, talk to the player and ask them about their backstory. Even if it's after the session 0 and after you have things kind of set up, ask them, what's your PC's motivation? What is the real motivation? Why is this person doing this? Why are they becoming an adventurer? Because as much as, in a place like the Forgotten Realms, there are adventurers everywhere. But are there really? I mean, there aren't. In the brain of your players, there aren't adventurers everywhere. There are commoners everywhere, and they're the adventurers in the story. So why is that person leaving their livelihood and their family and whatever to go be an adventurer when it's extremely dangerous? It might not be lucrative at all. They might get embroiled in some kind of cult worship issues. Like, there's all these horrible things in the world. They might accidentally get fried by a dragon, right? Like, all of these things are known dangers. Why is this person leaving? Just ask them what their motivation is, rather than trying to give them the motivation of revenge. If you want to give them the motivation of revenge, have the villain show up early and rub their nose in a very small mistake they made and say, this is why you're too weak to defeat me, and then have that villain leave. And now they'll hate that villain, right? And they'll be able to have the motivation of revenge against that villain. But it's not about completely twisting and taking away that PC's backstory, right? So keep the player agency intact, even if you're going to fiddle with the backstory, or even if you're going to change, their rival, right? Their rival suddenly is much more successful or much less successful than what they said in the background. Well, there might be a reason for that, and they can suss that out, but don't just completely obliterate their hometown, or, completely, change everything in their background just because you're trying to make it dramatic, because that's not going to work.
Plenty of other ways to do that.
Right. Exactly. So those are my 3 watch out fors. Those are my 3 kind of gotchas that you don't want to throw your party into.
This is excellent advice. And what I really like about it is that it feels scalable, so that if you are new, you can, ask for 2 things from or just one thing, and, and then practice working backstory in at your own pace. I like that. Right. And I also really like that if you're a new dungeon master, and maybe if you're running a homebrew and you maybe are a little worried about some story elements, like, this could potentially spawn some ideas. Like, for you to think about in your story. So I think overall it's really good advice.
Yeah. Well, good. Baby steps. That's the key, right?
Baby steps.
If you've never done this before and you're a newer DM or you're an experienced DM, but you really only run published items or you only run homebrew things, but you're thinking that you work the characters in because you tell them about the themes of the story and then you let them make their characters, baby step it. Just baby step the idea of, hey, if they have a rival or an organization or a family or some kind of background that can be pulled on, tiny baby step, baby step. And also let them add things too. Not to interrupt you, sorry.
No, I was just saying I really like this.
Yeah, so let them add things. If the player says, well, my older brother was taken off and he went to the wizarding school, or he went off and went to go become a druid, well, that's really awesome. What happened to that brother? Right?
Yeah.
And ask the player, what happened to your brother? What was the last time you saw him? What's the thing? And there's another caveat in there, and that is don't let the brother come back and be the savior, right? He's not a what do they call it? A deus ex machina, right? He's not the hand of God coming in to rescue them, okay? But he could be a great resource if they have something they need to find out about the forest, or the animals in the forest suddenly changed, or something changed about the weather, but it didn't affect the forest. Well, you have a druid in this PC's background that you didn't really do anything about yet, but hey, through some weird permutation of the campaign, now they need this information. It's okay to say to that player, hey, wasn't your brother a druid? Like, didn't you said he went off and was a druid? Yeah. Okay, let's go see your brother. What was the name of the forest? Where was the forest? Which forest did he go to? What was the name of the druid mentor that he had that came and took him from your family? Is he a shape changer? What kind of animal does he normally take the shape of that he identifies with? And let the player tell you. Let the player determine all of those things. That makes them more invested as well.
Absolutely. This is great. I see now why you were called out as an expert in this field. It's great. And it sounds like your players are very lucky and that you're a really great dungeon master. So,
well, I hope so. Like I said, it's all about learning all the time, right? I kind of, sometimes I say, well, if you're an experienced DM or a new DM, well, guess what? It doesn't matter how long you've been DMing or how short a time you've been DMing. If you're trying and you're changing things a little bit and you're learning every time, then you are doing awesome. Keep it up. Keep doing it. It's a ton of fun. Not everybody has the best session ever every time. That's impossible, right? And even experienced DMs have cases where they don't have that, and just keep doing it and baby steps the entire way. And eventually enough time will have passed and enough baby steps will have been taken that you've gone a mile and you didn't even know it.
There you go. So if people want to find out more about your podcast, your live streaming, your work, just ask you maybe advice about dungeon mastering, where's the best place to find all of that?
The best place to find all of that is you can, there's a podcast called The Tome Show. It's the longest running non-Wizards of the Coast D&D podcast.
Yes.
It's iconic. I'm the main editor there, and I'm also the guest host on multiple episodes. And one of the shows we have on there is called Behind the DM Screen.
Nice.
And it's me and two other DMs, and we basically talk about our campaigns, what's going on in them, and then talk about advice, or how did this go, or can you give me advice for this type of thing, or I want to plan this, what do you think about that? And then that's all recorded and released in podcast form so that you can kind of hear the minds of dungeon masters as they're working through their own issues in certain games. So there's that. And also, if you enjoy older editions, I co-host the Edition Wars podcast, which is also on that channel with a gentleman named Brandis Stoddard, who is just a font of knowledge and highly esteemed colleague of mine. And you can find my writings at rpgmusings.com, which is my website, and I write there and I talk about my games. And you can follow me on Twitter at DM Samuel. And I run also my DnDeBrief show has also now on the Tome Show. It was on a different channel before, but now it's on the Tome Show. So really, the best place to find me is probably the Tome Show. But if you want to go to RPG Musings or to Twitter, you can do that as well. And I love talking to people about this stuff. I mean, this is my main hobby. This is kind of what I do other than my, quote, real job. So, ask questions, send me a message, however you want to do it. The Tome Show has a Discord. So if you send me a message and say, hey, how do I get to your Discord? We can add you to that. And yeah, so
that's great. I always love to see how members of the community help support other members of the community. So thank you for everything. And thank you so much for being a guest. You talk about a wealth of knowledge.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun. And I hope I didn't just talk your ear off and not let you get word in edgewise.
This is excellent information. I think people are really going to learn a lot from you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Until we meet again, my friend.
Yes.
I'm going to go just write up some backstories just for fun.
It's perfect, right? And make sure you integrate them in with the NPCs and the other players.
I love that. Such good advice. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.